Tours from the Deep, St. Louis Cemetery, number 3. A quick note. Some memorial customs followed in New Orleans include leaving flowers or stones after a visit, which you are welcome to participate in to show your respect. But please do not leave any trash or an offering that will become trash. I will take you past several of the commonly toured tombs in this cemetery, but we will also visit some lesser-known tombs, the occupants of which deserve often neglected recognition. Before we begin, an invocation for this tour. We visit this resting place with peace and respect, honoring the lives of those remembered here. We've come today to participate in the long-held tradition of ancestor worship, like many of the cultures that comprise the gumbo of New Orleans. We mean no harm, and while we are tourists in your home, we come with reverence and solemnity, seeking the knowledge you left in this realm. We have no intention of disturbing any offerings or displays or taking inappropriate selfies to document our visit. We will treat you, ancestors, as our own. If you get lost along the way, use the Google map linked in the description to reorient. We start at the entrance on Esplanade Avenue. Use the main gate, known as the St. Louis entrance, in the center. Walking through the gates, you'll find a long row of above-ground tombs straight ahead. The stunning entrance to this city of the dead is lined with angels guarding the tombs, an old fashion that was common when this cemetery was still considered the new St. Louis Cemetery. But before you go too far, on your left you'll find a corner sometimes called Chef's Corner, because of the names of prominent chefs that grace the tombs in this first block of the cemetery. Like Westminster has Poets' Corner, it's only fitting that New Orleans should have Chef's Corner. On the grave marked Jobert Tujague, notice how many names are listed over the decades. While this is not the Tujague family of the restaurant, this tomb is representative of the style of burials in New Orleans. Each tomb can hold many people, so each tomb is like a household, making this truly a city of the dead, with thousands of souls resting here. We'll meet the Tujagues of restaurant fame at the end of the tour. But how are there so many souls in each tomb? It starts with the ingenious concept of a caveau. Caveau means cellar or burial chamber in French, and it is an opening in the back of the inside of a tomb. In order to add another family member to a tomb, the last person buried is removed, and the remains are cremated or crushed, or if they are decomposed enough, this step is not needed. Then they are put back in and pushed to the back opening to fall into the caveau. The new family member is interred in the casket. By law, the funeral home has to destroy any old caskets. Some tours will tell a story about how the wall vaults that run along the outside of the cemetery are temporary storage for family members who die before the body is properly decomposed. The legend is that if another family member dies before 1 year and 1 day has passed after the last family member, the wall vaults are used to store the remains until the proper time has passed to add the next person to the tomb. This is because 1 year and 1 day will require that the deceased spend a New Orleans summer in a home that resembles a pizza oven, so they will surely be decomposed. However, this was never a Louisiana law, and the wall vaults are cheaper, permanent tombs for many people. At the first intersection, take a left before the Mother Teresa statue. The second tomb on the left is the Prudhomme family tomb, where Chef Paul Prudhomme is possibly buried. While Chef Paul is listed as buried in St. Louis number 3, there are no names on this tomb to verify. The family listed according to the Archdiocese is not the family of our beloved Chef Paul. Regardless of whether this is his final resting place, Chef Paul Prudhomme deserves our honor today. He is the reason so many of us know what Cajun and Creole cooking are in the modern day. As a child, he grew up on a sharecropping farm, one of 13 children, and learned to live off the land and use everything. As a result of this influence in his fine dining cuisine, he can be credited with beginning the farm-to-table movement. He was also one of the first American fine dining chefs breaking the tradition that deemed it necessary for French-trained chefs in fine dining. He was also almost responsible for the extinction of a species of fish, thanks to his inventive take on what was once considered a lower quality catch. He was born in 1940 in Opelousas, Louisiana, in the southwest of the state, and began cooking early. While his first restaurant failed, he eventually served as head chef of the legendary restaurant Commander's Palace. He appeared in many PBS specials, spreading the delicious taste of South Louisiana to the whole country. He was also featured regularly in a syndicated segment called The Magic of Chef Paul, which was broadcast across the country on local news stations. Dishes he is known for are blackened redfish, which nearly caused the extinction, and turducken. His restaurant, K. Paul's Louisiana Kitchen, unfortunately closed during the pandemic, but his legacy lives on in the influence he wielded over the kitchens of the entire country. You can find his spice blends with his smiling face in grocery stores nationwide, which spawned from his habit of keeping his personal blend in his pocket to hand out to customers for free. He died in 2015. Walking on the path left of the Prudhomme tomb toward Esplanade Avenue, behind the Jobert Tujague tomb, you'll find the tomb of Jean Galatoire, who is the representative chef, actually for sure buried on Chef's Corner. Jean is the Galatoire of Galatoire's restaurant on Bourbon Street. Galatoire's today is known for refusing reservations for its first floor dining room and its raucous Friday lunches, where the cream of the New Orleans business, politics, and society meet to celebrate another week. Tennessee Williams preferred a seat by the window and immortalized the restaurant in a streetcar named Desire. Jean Galatoire was originally from rural France and immigrated first to Mobile before making it to New Orleans. He had a saloon near Canal and a restaurant au Dauphine before he secured the Bourbon Street location in 1905. He started serving his signature dishes from his homeland and hosted any type of society that needed a place to land. Waiting in line for a table on the first floor is considered by some to be a place to be seen, and some will hire placeholders to ensure their spot for lunch. Galatoire's is still serving out memories for visitors and locals alike on Bourbon Street. We will get to meet two more famous New Orleans chefs before this tour is complete. For now, return to the main path and turn left, continuing forward. Straight ahead, you will see a mausoleum for the United Slavonian Benevolent Society next to a statue of Padre Pio. In all cemeteries in New Orleans, you will find mausoleums of benevolent societies, and there are 12 in this cemetery so far. Benevolent societies were social aid groups, often divided by religion or ethnicity, that offered social services to members, such as a spot in the mausoleum upon death. Often, benevolent societies were specifically seeking to help immigrants who were poor and needed help, using the idea that we are stronger together than we are apart. Benevolent societies provided benefits, and one was burial insurance. If family tombs are like a household with many people and a family buried, then society tombs are like condos with many different families housed. Continue to the right down St. Paul Avenue toward the next intersection. At the grassy intersection on the right, before the next paved intersection, follow it and take the first left. 7 tombs from the end on the right is the tomb of Florville Foy. Along the way, I'll share some information about the cemetery with you. Also look at the bottom right side of the grave markers for the signatures of the marble sculptors who made them. Many read Florville. In the Catholic cemeteries, you will see many plaques that read Perpetual Care. Perpetual Care is a service provided by the Archdiocese of New Orleans that ensures that graves will be cared for, regardless of what family remains or how long the grave is there. There are many graves in the older cemeteries that are falling completely apart because the family is long lost and they did not sign up for perpetual care. To counteract this, a nonprofit organization called Save Our Cemeteries raises funds to ensure all graves are cared for. Florville Foy is inextricably tied to the New Orleans tradition of above-ground burials, but he is rarely discussed in New Orleans tours, even those in the cemeteries. Born a free person of color in New Orleans to Prosper Foy, a Frenchman, and a free woman of color, he learned the craft of marble cutting and sculpting from his father. A common tale told about this custom is that the low water table will cause the tombs to expel their bodies when it rains. This has long been told and shared and spread widely. It does work well with the spooky qualities of New Orleans. I've heard about bodies floating up after the floods of Katrina, and I've even seen posts by Instagram witches about gathering bones from cemeteries after the rain because of this. But this legend is not rooted in reality. Canal Street was never a canal with bodies floating by. The mafia are much more discreet than that. The first colonists who died in New Orleans were buried on the banks of the Mississippi River, but they did not stay buried there long as the river rises and falls. This is perhaps where the legend of floating bodies comes from. Before the St. Louis cemeteries 1 through 3 were built, there was a cemetery in the French Quarter called St. Peter. But because of the fear of yellow fever, which was not yet understood, they moved the cemetery out of the city limits, building St. Louis No. 1 in 1789. Once they started building graves there, they built above ground in the style of the Europeans. But these first above ground tombs were plain vaults made of brick. St. Louis No. 2 opened in 1823. J.N.B. Dupuyer, who arrived in New Orleans in 1833 and is the architect responsible for the current iteration of St. Louis Cathedral, started designing graves like those of his hometown of Paris, like you might find in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. Florville Foy was the marble cutter who built the tombs designed by Dupuyer, and many of the tombs in these cemeteries. He is at least in part responsible for the elaborate landscape of our resting places that draws so many visitors. Florville signed his tombs, like many marble cutters, and you can find his signature on his own tomb. As you walk around today, notice the artists etched into their works. You'll see many by Florville along the way. As you explore the cemetery, you will also find many graves that are not built above ground and still hold their contents firmly protected, further proving that this custom is not rooted in the trauma of unmoored corpses. Go back to St. Paul Avenue and continue away from Esplanade Avenue. You'll find the Bellocq tomb on the right, 6 from the next paved intersection. A.J. Bellocq is known as the photographer who revealed Storyville to us. He was long interested in photography, and he came from a prominent family, but he was not well known during his lifetime. He was a commercial photographer. After his death, the plates for photographs he had taken of sex workers in the notorious Storyville district were discovered. Storyville, nicknamed for the mayor at the time as an insult, was a sectioned off area of the city where the typically illegal activities were allowed, like sex work and gambling, so they wouldn't happen so close to the river in public view. He was probably one of the many photographers who documented Storyville, as one of the sex workers from the time claimed in an interview that there were many dirty photographers, but not Bellocq, and only his photos seem to remain. Storyville, which lasted from 1897 through 1917, is also known as the place where jazz developed, as Louis Armstrong and other early jazz musicians played in the Storyville clubs, among some 2,000 sex workers and 230 known houses of prostitution. Belloq's candid images showed a different side of the area than was typically represented in the media, as he must have been a confidant of sorts to these women, possibly because they were fellow outcasts. He was described as a, quote, small, misshapen man, reminiscent of the artist Toulouse-Lautrec, whose craft seems to have absorbed most of his energy and interest, and of whom little else is known, unquote. Those who knew him said he was relentlessly bullied because of his appearance. One of the sex workers who knew him said he was always polite. His images were displayed at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1970. The originals of many of Belloq's discovered works had the faces scratched out, but it's not clear who did it. Perhaps it was his brother, who was a priest. Storyville closed in 1917 as the United States entered World War I. If you look at this tomb closely, you can see faint remnants of colorful paint. Colorful tombs used to be much more common, but you can still find a few brightly painted tombs as you explore today. Continuing, turn right on the next paved path and follow it to the last paved path just before the St. Teresa Garden Mausoleum, and turn left before the Pietà statue. 7 tombs from the end on the left is the tomb of Thomy LaFon. I'll give you some background information on the cemetery as you find it. Built around the middle of the 19th century, St. Louis Cemetery No. 3 is located 2 blocks from City Park on beautiful Esplanade Avenue. It is a quintessential New Orleans City of the Dead, with organized streets of above-ground tombs that resemble little buildings on miniature blocks. The tombs even have an address. St. Louis No. 3 is the largest of the early city cemeteries that still exists. It was expanded several times since it was built in response to the yellow fever epidemic that just would not quit. Symptoms of yellow fever include jaundice, fever, nausea, delirium, and eventually bleeding through the eyes. It is spread by a specific type of mosquito, and outbreaks occurred during the summer months in early New Orleans. It was a serious problem, killing hundreds or thousands each year. They believed that it was spread through the fumes given off of rotting corpses that had died of yellow fever, which they called the vapors. They did not understand that mosquitoes were how it spread until the 1890s, so any mitigation efforts, such as building cemeteries outside of the city, did not help to prevent the outbreaks, which killed significant portions of the population. After the disease was understood and a city water system was installed around 1916, water cisterns were largely dismantled to prevent the reproduction of mosquitoes, which rely on standing water. Yellow fever was also considered the stranger's disease for a time because folks who had grown up in New Orleans and lived through outbreaks as children were thought to be acclimated. Proving you were acclimated had a lot to do with how long you had been in the city. Perhaps this explains some of the lingering divide between transplants and those from New Orleans. Famous residents who were taken out by yellow fever include Andrew Jackson and Benjamin Latrobe. St. Louis No. 1 was built when they thought that yellow fever was contagious to move the cemetery out of the city just beyond the ramparts in 1789. St. Louis No. 2 was built a few blocks away and a little further from the city in 1823. Approval was given to build St. Louis No. 3 on Esplanade even further from the city when those started to fill. Near Bayou St. John was very far from the city at that time. While it was approved in 1849, approval was rescinded as the neighbors there also did not want a cemetery nearby, just like the citizens in the city. The worst year on record was 1853, when more than 8,000 citizens died of yellow fever. The first report of a burial in St. Louis No. 3 was in 1855, but the cemetery wasn't opened officially until after a neighbor fought to the Louisiana Supreme Court to prevent it, but he lost. It was known as the New St. Louis Cemetery at first and became an affordable place for many New Orleanians to buy burial plots. Today it is still a very active cemetery with on average one burial a day. There are approximately 3,000 wall vaults, 2,000 family tombs, and 12 society tombs. The next tomb, Mr. Thomy LaFon, is the final resting place of the first Black millionaire. He was born to a Frenchman and a free woman of color who was of Haitian descent and had been born in slavery. It is said that Thomy could have denied his African heritage and passed as a white man during his lifetime, but he refused. He was likely named after Bartholomew LaFon. His mother was a mistress of LaFon. While he came from a humble background, he worked as a commission broker and a real estate investor. It is said he lived frugally, but his estate outlined in the newspaper lists jewelry, movable items, and silverware among his valuables. He was more likely one of the many free people of color who lived very well before the Civil War, with well-appointed homes and well-educated children, although it seems that Thomy never married or had children. He amassed a large enough fortune to be known as a philanthropist during his life and still left almost $500,000 behind when he died in 1893, or about $17 million in 2023 money, which he willed to various organizations. The Louisiana legislature commissioned a bust of him after he died, which was apparently the first statue of a person of color in the South. Return to the St. Teresa Mausoleum and pass through it to the last avenue of the cemetery. Walk toward Esplanade Avenue and find the third tomb from the wall vault closest to Esplanade with the name Parlongue. As we walk toward the next tomb, let's learn more about free people of color in New Orleans before the Civil War, like Mr. Thomy LaFon. In all of my Louisiana history classes growing up, and I am a product of Louisiana public schools, I never remember learning anything beyond Black people were slaves. I never once learned about the 1811 revolt along the Mississippi that is known as the largest slave revolt in the United States history. and my education was sometimes even bastardized to make the disgusting lost cause claim that enslaved people were treated well by their masters and liked being slaves. But the truth is that not all people of color were enslaved before the Civil War. And free people of color lived well and acquired wealth during their lifetime. In The Aubreys, Free People of Color in Early New Orleans, Carol Mills Nichols explains that we can account for 2 physicians, both educated in France, 2 architects, an engineer, commission brokers, one was Thomy LaFon, whose tomb we just visited, and owners of cigar factories just in New Orleans between 1850 and 1860. In 1836, free people of color owned $2.4 million in real estate in New Orleans. Free women of color owned more real estate outright than their white women counterparts because of the rules against mixed-race marriages, leading women of color to remain in charge of their own affairs. It's clear that the lives of the free people of color have been left out of the historical narrative, so we will try to reclaim some of that lost history. Florville Foy and Thomy LaFon are only 2 of these influential figures who shaped our culture. Many free people of color are buried in this cemetery, as cemeteries in New Orleans were divided primarily by religion, not race. The next family we meet also has strong connections to the free people of color in New Orleans before the Civil War, but that part of their story is often left out. As you reach the Parlongue tomb, I'll flesh out the full story of the sisters who gave the Court of Two Sisters its name. In the 1990s, the current owners of the Court of Two Sisters restaurant did extensive research and discovered that this grave is the location of the eponymous sisters. They added the plaque you see. This is one of the Parlongue family tombs in this cemetery. Henry, or Henri, had several brothers, some of whom are also buried here. The restaurant lists the sisters' last name as Camours, though, not Parlongue. So why are they buried here? The sisters outlived all of their family, so it was a neighbor who helped ensure they were properly buried. Did he make a mistake? Paul, Emma, and Bertha Camours were all born in New Orleans just before the Civil War to Eliza Ridecker and Bertrand Camours. Eliza was born in France. In many of the accounts of the sisters, the missing link for the Camours family is their father, Bertrand. Elusive, he died early and seems to have been lost to most historical records. However, we find Bertrand in Eliza's will, Emma's birth record, a few newspaper articles, and possibly military records, which seem to point to his participation in the Civil War as a Confederate who did not return. There are 2 B. Camours listed in the rolls of Confederate soldiers, but I was unable to confirm if any were Bertrand. Bertha is probably the namesake of Bertrand. Camours would have been the name on the sisters' birth or baptismal records, and it was the name that Paul, who is listed 5th in the tomb, always used. But it was not the name the sisters used as children or as adults before they were married, nor was it their mother's maiden name. It was their father's name, but before the sisters were 10 years old, they had abandoned it. In the announcement for Paul's wedding in 1886, he is Camours, and Bertha, listed as one of his bridesmaids, is Parlongue. The announcement also mentions that Paul has worked for Henri for some years. Henri Parlongue Jr., who is listed 2nd in the tomb as H. Parlongue, was a successful tailor who worked out of several shops in the French Quarter. His mother seems to have died early, but we do have a record of her in a census showing that she was mulatto. Henri is listed as mulatto also until his mother disappears from the records. It is assumed she died, but we do not have a record for her death. From then on, he's listed as white, like his father, Henri Sr., whose grave is in a wall vault closest to Esplanade on the other side of this cemetery. Henri was the 2nd husband of Eliza Ridecker, according to her will and many other records. Eliza is Mrs. H. Parlongue, who is listed 3rd in the tomb. Henri and Eliza were officially married in 1872, but their daughters, Emma and Bertha, took the last name Parlongue sometime earlier than that. They were listed as Parlongue in numerous newspaper articles about their education, another detail that has gotten lost along the way. Some sources claim the sisters were not educated, and some claim they were educated in France. They also used Parlongue as their maiden name when they were written about in the society pages before their marriages. Instead of forsaking the name of their stepfather in favor of their Confederate father, They seem to have done the exact opposite, down to being buried in the grave of their mixed-race family. The sisters both married. Emma married Raphael Musso, who is listed fourth. He went by Ralph. Bertha married twice, first to Baldo Angot, who is listed first on the tomb. Bertha's father-in-law, Emile Angot, was the owner of the property at 613 Royal Street, where the sisters made their shops home and where the Court of Two Sisters still resides. The cracked plaque that has fallen on the ground in front of the wall vault to the right of the Parlongue family tomb is the marker of Baldo's mother, Josephine Angot, and his sister, Jeanne Delval. The sisters were largely forgotten in their old age. After they closed their shop in 1906, the building was used for many types of shops, but in the 1920s it becomes a restaurant for the first time. They are buried here in St. Louis No. 3 with the Parlongue family, with whom they identified while they were living, even if they are remembered as Cammours today. Continue down the grassy avenue toward Esplanade. Make a right at the paved path Peñalver Avenue, past the next paved path to the large tomb on the corner of St. Madeleine Aisle, the Gallier tomb. The architectural grave without any angels or crosses, marked Gallier, is in memory of James Gallier Sr., a famed architect of New Orleans, and it was designed by his son, James Gallier Jr., another famed architect of New Orleans. James Sr. is responsible for Gallier Hall on St. Charles Avenue, which was once the New Orleans City Hall building, and St. Patrick's Church on Camp Street. James Jr. is responsible for Gallier House on Royal Street and the French Opera House on Bourbon and Toulouse Streets, which burned in 1919. James Sr. was from Ireland and was originally James Gallagher. His name became Gallier when he moved to New Orleans and joined the Creoles. It wasn't uncommon for names to become French when they became residents of New Orleans. He was well known as an architect in his day, but many of his buildings did not survive to the present day. He married Elizabeth Tyler in 1823, and their only surviving child was James Jr. Elizabeth is memorialized on the back portion of the tomb with a plaque. She died in 1844. In 1866, James Sr. and his second wife, Catherine, were on a voyage from New York to New Orleans on a ship called the Evening Star. Catherine was 24 years younger than her husband. The ship sunk when en route due to a hurricane, and almost everyone on board died, which included an unbelievable mix of people, such as an opera troupe, a ballet company, and dozens of trafficked sex workers, according to numerous accounts. James Jr. built and designed this tomb for his father and stepmother. He died 2 years later, probably of a stroke. As you walk around the tomb to see Elizabeth's plaque, you'll see the Young Men's Benevolent Society Mausoleum, another example of a society tomb, on your left. Continuing down the grassy path away from Esplanade, which is officially St. Madeleine Aisle of the cemetery. In the second block on the left toward the middle, you'll find the Chase Reese tomb. Leah Chase is the queen of Creole cuisine and the next chef on our journey today. She was born Leah Lang in 1923 in Madisonville, Louisiana, and she was one of many children whose family struggled through the Depression. Her family is truly rooted in Louisiana, with only one grandparent not from Louisiana, and they were from Mississippi. She learned to cook and learned about food through her childhood experiences. She came to New Orleans to attend Catholic school, which was not available to blacks in Madisonville at the time. She attended St. Mary's Academy, the land for which was donated by Thomy LaFon, who we met earlier. She married Edgar Dookie Chase II in 1946, whose family owned a po' boy shop in the Treme. Eventually, the couple turned the shop into a sit-down establishment. Dookie Chase was the first white tablecloth fine dining establishment for people of color, and many of Chef Leah's recipes were used to create the dishes enjoyed by everyone. Dookie Chase was an essential location for secret civil rights planning meetings in New Orleans, where Chef Leah served them delicious food. Chef Leah recalled in a 2014 interview with WDSU, "The Freedom Rides, when those left from New Orleans to meet them in Birmingham and the other places, they came here first. I fed them, and they would really always have their meetings over a bowl of gumbo and some fried chicken." Dookie Chase is still a family-run restaurant with the fourth generation at the helm, and it's still a place for politician stops, serving both George W. Bush and Barack Obama, who made a memorable 2008 visit where Chef Leah had to explain not to add hot sauce to gumbo zerbs to the presidential candidate. Chef Leah died in 2019. Continuing away from Esplanade on St. Madeleine Isle, crossing the paved path to Bourg Avenue, roughly 10 tombs in, on the left, you'll find the G. Tujague tomb. This is the Tujague family of restaurant fame. But before we discuss the Tujague family, we must first discuss Madame Béguet and the origin of the Brunch. Located across from the French Market on what is now Decatur Street, Madame Béguet is known for her butcher's breakfast, which was served later than normal breakfast and was a more filling meal than normal, accounting for the butcher's early wait time and the tendency to skip breakfast. She catered to the butchers who worked in the market. Tujague's restaurant was down the street, and he more or less copied her late breakfast style. He was known for being a micromanager with his staff, but was kind and generous with the poor and hungry. He was a member of several benevolent societies, including the Butchers' Benevolent Association, and his restaurant was well known before he died. However, after he died in 1814, the restaurant was moved to the Madame Béguet's location, where it remained until 2020, when it moved up the street 4 blocks. Tujague's is known as the city's second oldest restaurant. That is the last tomb in the oldest parts of the cemetery that we will explore, so a benediction for your tour. Ancestors, we thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today and helping us understand better the history and culture of New Orleans. We honor ourselves for taking the time to learn from you, and we honor you for your many contributions to our progress. All of you paved the way for us to enjoy this city, and enjoy it we shall. Send me a message or email if you have any story ideas or tours that you would like to see. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more tours and stories from the deep. Secret track. In case you're looking for more, I have 2 bonus memorials for you. The first I will share on your journey to the second, as the first tomb's location is a mystery, and the second is almost all the way at the back of the very large cemetery. Walk to the last avenue on the right side of the cemetery, and then just keep walking all the way, almost to the back. The last tomb on the right, before the last set of wall vaults, is the one you're looking for. It says Tureaud. While you walk, let me introduce you to the Honorable Charles E. Nash. Charles E. Nash was the only African American from Louisiana to serve in Congress during Reconstruction. Yes, I said Reconstruction, as in the period after the Civil War, Reconstruction. Louisiana did not send another person of color to Congress until William Jefferson was elected in 1991, more than a century later. Charles served in Congress from 1875 to 1877. He rose to power after he served in the Civil War. He was born a free person of color in St. Landry Parish and attended public schools, so he had no special education. He served in the military for the Union, but was discharged after losing his leg in battle. Shortly after, he was hired for a federal patronage position as a night inspector in the New Orleans Custom House. He started earning attention in this role and soon became politically motivated. In 1874, he was nominated to represent the 6th District of Louisiana. In 1875, he married Martha Wyckoff. In the same year, he was elected to the 44th term of Congress. This term had a remarkable 8 congressmen of color from the South elected to serve. He experienced difficulty as a lawmaker. He was only placed on 1 committee during his 2-year term. He was prevented from speaking on the House floor. He was nominated for and ran for a 2nd term, but the details around the outcome are unclear in the newspaper records. Nash was involved in some kind of voting scandal, but the newspaper article seems very biased. He did not serve a 2nd term. He went on to serve as postmaster in St. Landry Parish, but returned to New Orleans soon and finished his life as a cigar maker. He is said to be buried in this cemetery, but the location is unknown. There are no Nash family tombs, nor are there tombs for either of his wives' families here. There are many tombs that have lost their marble markers, or the names have worn off, or they are broken or unreadable for other reasons. He could certainly be resting in one of them. Our final memorial today is Alexander Pierre Tureaud, a civil rights leader and lawyer from New Orleans. He is yet another example of a person of color who was light enough to, quote, pass as white. He attended Howard University and joined the NAACP. While a student, he was able to join segregationist meetings as a spy due to his complexion. He returned to New Orleans and spent the rest of his life fighting to ensure that all people were treated equally as a legal defense fund lawyer for the NAACP. Before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, he had helped to desegregate public areas in New Orleans and equalize teacher pay regardless of race. He received much praise for his works, including a letter to the editor from the Archbishop of New Orleans at the time. In a letter in the Times-Picayune, Albert W. Dent wrote, quote, "During the last 40 years, no New Orleanian has contributed as much to social progress and the opening of doors to fuller opportunity. The present generation, which fortunately has never fully known the injustices, oppressions, and denials that Alexander P. Tureaud fought to eradicate, will live fuller and more dignified lives because Mr. Tureaud lived and worked among us." I'll leave you with some final thoughts today. Almost all of the people of color we discussed are described as being able to pass for white. This ever-repeating anthem in the biographies of our great ancestors reminds me of two things. One, race is a social construct, and then, like today, we have trouble distinguishing each other, even within our own rules. And two, there is privilege in passing as white that cannot be refused. White privilege is demonstrated by our history and even in the stories we choose to repeat. We must continue to dig deeper. More coming soon.